Marvel Snap's most recent patch got some pretty controversial reactions, and I think I know why. First things first, what actually happened in the patch? Well, Mojo got a little bit of a functional change, and now he will work on the Space Throne. Uatu became a card that works in the deck rather than only when he's in the hand. Maria Hill became a 1/2 that gives you a 2-drop. Cable became a 3/4, now competing with Agent Coulson. And Mantis went from a 1/2 to a 2/3. Not very exciting, is it? And I think that's problem one. Previous patches have brought significant shakeups to the metagame. One could argue that these patches, containing functional changes for cards already in the game, were one of the primary ways for players to acquire new cards. When those cards were changed in terms of functionality, that often meant that they were able to be viable in the metagame again. For example, in last month's update, Snowguard went from being an incredibly underplayed and poorly performing card to a card that was so good it had to get nerfed in a future OTA. That's not all though. That update also contained a functional change to Blade, making a card that everyone has into a much more useful piece of all the archetypes that it was in. 2 months ago, the headline change was Spider-Man, who ended up becoming a staple in the move deck and made an iconic character incredibly relevant in the metagame without being incredibly painful to play against. What I'm getting at here is there was an iconic or impactful change in previous patches, and this current patch just doesn't live up to those expectations. For the record, of the cards that were changed in this patch, I believe I'm the most excited about Maria Hill. We saw how powerful adding a decent 2-cost card to your hand was when we had Snowguard around. She's a lot worse, don't get me wrong, but there might be at least something to experiment with there. The rest of the changes, apart from Uatu, who I think probably needs a little more time to sizzle out so we can figure out how exactly to evaluate him in his current state, the rest of the changes were minimal. They didn't really do anything. There was no game-changing anything in these patches at all. Nothing happened. And when you've set an expectation of something big happens every patch, when that expectation is not met, there can be some issues from your audience. Take a look at this screenshot from the Marvel Snap Discord. You'll see the most used emoji to react to the dev notes was putting it in a trash can. I think it's become pretty clear that players expect these patches to be major events in the game, and also I think this is a secondarily pernicious issue, that players who are mostly free-to-play get new cards when there is a functional change to a Series 3 or below card. These are now things that they already own that are receiving an upgrade. And I think that Second Dinner may have touched on an underlying dynamic by not providing one of those. What underlying dynamic am I talking about? Well, in this case, the underlying dynamic I'm referring to is that the only way to acquire new cards in Marvel Snap is by paying a lot. Meanwhile, getting old cards is extremely easy. So what this does is create a situation where every bit of new content outside of these patches is paywalled. You want to be playing with Elsa Bloodstone? Well, that's $10 for the Battle Pass, and that's actually the cheapest new card you're going to get. So we're in a situation where a lot of players who want to be playing for free-to-play players, the most excitement they're going to get is when a card is changed dramatically or when a card is buffed to playability. An example of this from an OTA would be Forge's buff, making that very free-to-play card a very relevant metagame threat. For this reason, I don't think it's a coincidence that Loki and Alioth were among the cards that if you talk to people who are upset about this, they will tell you cards like Loki, cards like Alioth, those are the ones they're upset that they're not getting touched. Me personally, I believe Loki is currently in a very balanced spot. After the nerfs to Collector and Snowguard, I think his deck is pretty good, but no longer overpoweringly good at high levels of play. He's a relatively balanced card, but what they did to get there was they gutted the Collector outside of Loki decks, and they made Snowguard worse outside of Loki decks as well. And that's an interesting proposition in the context of the Collector, especially being a much easier card to acquire than Loki. Now what you're doing is you're damaging the experience of the players who have the Collector in order to solve the problem with Loki, instead of changing Loki, who was the ultimate culprit. Alioth, to its credit, has never really been as bad as Loki, but it does introduce another type of issue, which is complexity creep. Playing against Alioth requires you to recognize that you are playing against Alioth. It requires you to understand how to beat Alioth, and it requires you to be thinking about it all the time. It also requires an understanding of how priority in Marvel Snap works, which is not something the game explains to you. In fact, priority isn't even a term that the game uses. They don't even have a word for whose cards reveal first, and understanding whose cards reveal first is key to combating Alioth. And that sort of thing is a big reason why I think a lot of people hate it. Because if you don't understand this, then it just sucks. You just lose to it and you feel like you couldn't have done anything about it. For the record, I feel like they've handled balance on these cards relatively appropriately, but in each case, we saw other cards getting nerfed rather than the new card. In Alioth's case, we saw Galactus getting nerfed, which, for the record, I support. In Loki's case, we saw Collector and Snowguard getting nerfed, which, for the record, I mostly don't. I think they probably could have done something else there. But I understand why those decisions might have needed to be made. In other card games, this kind of thing isn't an issue. If you need to change the environment of the current set so that future card releases fit better within it and aren't overly dominant, you can usually do that because these cards are relatively fungible, right? If you're playing Hearthstone, a legendary card costs the same amount of dust, no matter what you're going to do with it. But if you're playing Marvel Snap, your card, it doesn't funge, if you will. You can't play with the new card. And your old card, the Collector, just got so much worse in everything you would have wanted to play it with, except the new card. So these are the issues that I have identified that have led to, 700 trash can emojis on an official post in the Marvel Snap Discord. I think that the way in which they balanced Alioth and Loki, or to be more specific, the way in which they balanced around them, set a precedent that people aren't exactly happy with. And that, coupled with the lack of significant changes, has made players feel as though they aren't being properly handled. Suddenly, early series cards, free-to-play cards, are seeing nerfs in order to make way for cards that can only be purchased with a ton of tokens or with $10 of real money. We just saw this happen again with Kitty Pryde. And again, this is an issue with Marvel Snap on the fundamental level. All of the new cards are expensive. All of the old cards are not. And so in a normal card game, they would be able to make these changes because the cards are priced similarly. But in Marvel Snap, the cards are not priced similarly. These are not the same. The new cards are always going to be expensive. And that, I think, is actually the fundamental problem. All right, y'all, that's going to be it for me. Let me know what your thoughts on my thoughts are, because I originally set out to make this video just be like, why are people mad about the patch? But I actually think the fact that people are mad about this patch speaks to a much greater underlying issue in Marvel Snap, and that is their content release model. And I don't know exactly what we're going to do about it, but I do want you to drop your thoughts in the comments because I don't really like being out of touch. What do you think about my read of this? Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been Cam Best. I will see you in the next one.